Il a raison, le Canada est un beau pays. Son Excellence m'en dira des nouvelles.
Oui, beau pays peut-être, mais c'est la fin du monde.
Of course, North America had been occupied for tens of thousands of years before Europe was advanced enough to venture there on their own. The Vikings had visited Newfoundland in about 1000 AD, and had even gone home to write about it. But no one takes a Viking seriously, right? Well, someone did, and there's evidence European fishermen were visiting the Grand Banks in the decades preceding Columbus's voyage of 1492. When governments finally got involved, it wasn't over some grand spirit of adventure.
Let's see what's out there.
No, it was for money. Ever since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, a new way to get to the east was actively being sought. The thought was, if you sail west, you hit China, right? So by 1500, mainly driven by Portugal and Spain, the New World was beginning to be mapped. Sadly, there was a continent or two in the way. The Italian John Cabot, sailing for the English and looking for the way through, visited the shores of Newfoundland and Labrador in 1497, giving them a claim they would not forget. It was the French who really got things rolling, which brings us to Jacques Cartier. He inadvertently named the new region and put Canada on the map.
What's he saying, Father?
Commandant Cartier is saying, this nation's name is Canada.
Canada. Canada.
Beg pardon, sir, but the word he used, I think it really means those houses down there.
No, believe me, I know the word. It means nation, and Canada is its name.
He too was looking for a way to China, and in 1535 became the first European to visit the island of Montreal. He was taken to the native village of Hochelaga, estimated to contain up to 1,000 people. The location of Hochelaga cannot now be determined, so let's put it here, shall we? Cartier did make one lasting contribution to Montreal. After climbing the mountain in the center of the island for the view, he named it Montreal. Internal affairs and a general lack of interest from the French public with that cold, awful place across the sea kept France out of the New World for much of the rest of the 16th century, on the books at least. Other European powers, on the other hand, have been much more active. The first nations encountered by Jacques Cartier, now known to historians as the St. Lawrence Iroquoian, had now largely disappeared. The region was not empty of European visitors, though, as unofficially traders were exploiting the growing fur trade. You could make a fortune. Enter Samuel de Champlain, soldier, adventurer, spy, and possible illegitimate son of a French king? Oh yes, please. He is one of the players in the on-again, off-again, sometimes violent story of the French monopolies over the fur trade. The early attempts at settlements had frankly been disasters. One shouldn't think of these as towns or even villages. These are tiny trading posts clinging on for dear life. And due to events in Europe, a one Sir David Kirke and his brothers, essentially English pirates, were able to seize New France from 1629 to 1632, until it was realized their actions were illegal and Charles I of England handed it all back again.
Nevertheless, you will kindly see that it does not happen again.
As essentially governor of New France, if not in name, Champlain in 1608 founded a trading post on the old native site of Stadacona, visited by Jacques Cartier in the 1530s, and named it Quebec. This would eventually grow into Quebec City. From this time began the legends of the Coureurs de Bois, French settlers set out to live and work with the First Nations, and also increase French economic interests.
L'incroyable mais réelle histoire d'un grand pionnier canadien.
Ladies and gentlemen, Cardinal Richelieu, who in France sets up his own company to get in on the action. Through him, the semi-feudal seigneurial land system is set up in New France in 1627, which would last into the 19th century.
I love you, my son, even when you fail.
Richelieu got a river named for him. And Champlain?
The blue waters of Lake Champlain lie between Vermont's Green Mountains and the great Adirondacks of New York State.
Champlain died at Quebec in 1635, leaving New France on slightly firmer footing than he had found it. Not long after, a religious organization in France took interest in a certain island in the St. Lawrence. And just what were they getting themselves into? Essentially a war zone. The driving force in this area during this period was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known in our sources as the Iroquois. Throughout the 17th century, this alliance of 5 nations were aggressively fighting their neighbors for dominance and control of contact with Europeans for the fur trade. France's involvement had started back in 1609, when Champlain had joined his native allies in an attack on an Iroquois settlement. All they really succeeded in doing was making bitter enemies. By the 1640s, the 5 nations were allied with the Dutch, who in 1624 had set up a trading post at Fort Orange, present-day Albany, New York. Through them, they acquired guns, making them much more formidable. Both they and the Dutch saw the advantages of making life in New France as unpleasant as possible. Which brings us back to Montreal. Not all of it, just this area down by the river, known today as Old Montreal. Home to commerce, religion, artists, and a few stories I could tell. This is how it appears today. Let's try to imagine the land as it was in the middle of the 17th century. Shorelines recede, small rivers appear. It's different, but not overly so. It was Champlain himself who first set up a small trading post in this area between 1611 and 1613, naming it Place Royale, a name that survives in a square on the spot. The point of land created by the now long-gone river is preserved in the street plan. So this was the site that awaited the first 50 settlers when they arrived on May 17, 1642. The area on the point was still cleared of trees, and they chose the same spot as the old trading post. Jean Mars had come from France, representing the Société Notre-Dame de Montréal, whose mission it was to bring Catholicism to North America. They were the driving force behind this endeavor. Paul de Chaumédy, Sieur de Maisonneuve, a military man, was chosen to be first governor, granted the right to use arms by Louis XIII of France. The new mission was largely confined to inside the fort for the first few years. Answered prayers for deliverance from flooding during the first winter prompted de Maisonneuve to erect a cross on the summit of Mount Royal. The current one commemorates this event. This publication from 1887 purports to show the colony in the first few years. The fort is easy to locate, as is the first Hôtel Dieu, built in about 1645 by Jean Mars as a hospital. The third structure, dating from the 1650s, is alternatively called a residence of de Maisonneuve or a seminary building. Whichever it was very early and long gone. The first brewery is set up in 1650 by one Louis Prudhomme just outside the fort. This is Montreal indeed. The wider situation for New France in this period is dire. The conflict, now known as the Beaver Wars, had moved into the St. Lawrence. New France's refusal in the 1640s to allow the Iroquois and Mohawks into the area's fur trade had by the 1650s resulted in the countryside under control of native forces. So in the context of this much wider conflict, Ville-Marie is under repeated attacks throughout the 1640s to the 1660s. Writing from France in 1652, de Maisonneuve himself feared that if help did not come soon, the colony would have to be abandoned. The next year, 1653, 100 new settlers were brought from France, known as the Grand Recul, an event still remembered. The town now begins to grow beyond the walls of the fort. We get the first major street, St. Paul, still a path at this point, running along the waterfront. An increase in attacks on Ville-Marie around 1660 makes its way into Canadian history books via the Battle of Long Sault, led by Dollard des Armeaux. He may have prevented the destruction of Ville-Marie, but it's also an interesting study into myth building. New France became a French province in 1663 under Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. One immediate result of this for Ville-Marie was the arrival of the first filles du roi, or daughters of the king, young women recruited to immigrate to the New World. Between 1663 and 1673, about 800 would make the voyage. The transfer of Fort Orange from Dutch to British control in 1664 did little to change the situation in New France. The forces opposing it just had new backers. Still, the first street plan is drawn up in 1672. Along with St. Paul, Notre Dame, and Saint Jacques now appear. This plan is mostly still in existence today. And what about the oldest building? Well, the oldest building in Montreal is not actually in Montreal. No, that honor goes to Lachine, first officially named in 1670. For you non-French-speaking viewers, this means China. They either still thought they had reached the mysterious East or someone was having a laugh.
Vous voyez bien que c'est possible.
I'm torn. The earliest surviving building on the island is the Lebert-le-Moine House of 1669 to 1671, beginning life as a trading post on the other side of the rapids. LaSalle Boulevard is the modern version of the footpath that used to connect Ville-Marie and Lachine. Future towns and cities now begin to appear across the island. Lachine, 1670. Verdun, 1671, and Baie-des-Fées in 1686. By the 1690s, the future Griffintown had picked up a reputation for licentiousness. Nice. Hey, wait a minute. There was a lake here? Let's have a look back in Ville-Marie at some of the buildings or their descendants you can still visit. The first Notre-Dame de Bon Secours chapel was built here in 1678. The current church is the second on this spot, built in 1771. The first Notre Dame church was built here in 1682. It was in use until the early 19th century when it was replaced by the current basilica. Its footprint is marked out in paving stones in the square, Place d'Armes, outside. Nearby is the Saint-Sulpice Seminary of 1684 to 87, although additions such as the clock date back to 1713. Hotel Dieu continued to grow and survived numerous fires. By the 18th century, it was this magnificent structure until it moved out of Old Montreal in the 19th century. The wars continued. The later phase, now known as King William's War, named for King William III of England, was a fight between the colonial powers of France and England and their First Nation allies. An event from this time known to all Montrealers is the Lachine Massacre of 1689, although few know the events that led to it. The old fort was now demolished and a wooden palisade is constructed around the city. The new fort, the Citadel, is constructed on the site of an earlier windmill. The Beaver Wars ended in 1701 with the signing of the Great Peace of Montreal between New France and 39 First Nations, signed at the spot where the city began. In 1705, Ville-Marie officially became Montreal. The Chateau Ramsay, the residence of the then governor, dates from this year. So with peace, the walls came down. Actually, no, they were rebuilt in stone, parts of the foundations of which can still be seen. Why, you may ask? To protect against the English. But that's another story.
Now Mohawk will fight les Français and Huron. I speak for the Twin River Mohawk of the Six Nations.
His Majesty King George II is very grateful for your support.